Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on real estate conversion organized by the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. My name is Aidan, and I'll be your moderator for this event. I'm a vice president here at StrategyCorp. Me and the rest of the land and infrastructure development team work with clients across the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors to help clients navigate all stages of their development. We help them go from concept development and council approvals to site planning, permit pulling, community liaising, even helping negotiate with political leaders, city officials, right down to construction staging. But today we're here to talk about an issue that Canada and Ontario are facing, and that's the major housing shortages amid high population growth. While housing supply is really tight in a lot of urban centers, we're seeing the opposite in the office buildings that dot our downtowns. We're seeing really high vacancy, as high as 18% in Toronto, according to data from CBRE. The effects of hybrid work are also felt in Ottawa, where the federal government is looking to reduce its portfolio significantly, and the city is looking at what to do with those new office buildings and what rate of conversion should be expected there. High office vacancy rates are not just an Ontario issue. The city of Calgary has been offering downtown office conversion programs, and in the United States, the White House just recently published a guidebook for people looking to convert commercial buildings to residential. We can provide more details on some of this in a follow-up email to everybody. But for today's webinar, we're joined by three experts with extensive municipal and land development expertise. And first is Ana Bailão, the head of affordable housing and public affairs at Dream. She was previously a Toronto City Councillor and Deputy City Mayor, and during her time at City Hall, Ana chaired the Planning and Housing Committee. Stephen Paynter is the Global Building Transformation Adaptive Reuse Leader at Gensler. He has led Gensler's research team in the development of a conversion algorithm that can assess office building stock to see if it is appropriate for conversion to residential. And finally, we have Mary Ellen Bench, my colleague here at StrategyCorp. She's a senior advisor, but prior to joining us, Mary Ellen held leadership roles in the legal departments at the City of Toronto and as the City of Mississauga City Solicitor. So we've prepared some questions for the panelists that will cover what we think are some of the most important dimensions of this conversation, but there will be some audience Q&A that we'll get into towards the end, and you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll also be providing a recording of this webinar that will be posted on StrategyCorp's social media account in the coming days. So without further ado, let's get started. So I think that one of the first things to sort of dig into here is what are some of the highest level considerations that go into converting a building from office to residential? And I think I'll start, Stephen, with you. If you can explain a little bit, what are the kinds of things that you would speak to a building owner that's considering doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. And good morning, everyone. So we actually, when we built the algorithm, it was to answer the question of which buildings work and which don't, and what factors affect that. And since then, since early 2020, we've actually reviewed about 1,400 buildings and really got into the fine-grained detail of what makes them work. It starts with simple stuff. You know, if you put residential there, would people want to live there? Which seems obvious, but obviously is critical in affecting the rents you can get and how quickly it will lease up or sell. And then right through to the detailed things, like how does the exterior wall work? What's that quarter window depth? And does that really lay out for a great one bed or studio unit? And then also what type of housing product you're trying to create. You know, some buildings work great for larger units, some are better for student housing, and so on. So we score about 150 different factors, but it really comes down to the nuance of each of the individual buildings, and what you can do with them to get the best value out of them.
So it's really interesting. And Anna, you're a former councillor, but you're also now working for one of Canada's largest building owners with a pretty substantial stock of office buildings in your portfolio. I'm wondering, so when you're working with others at Dream or working with others in the industry, what are the kinds of things that you're thinking about the actual buildings that you have in front of you?
Well, I think it's important to say that many of the people that own these office towers that are looking now into conversion, they have tried everything to make the office work. Even though that sometimes when you go to the different city halls, people don't believe that, but you're in the business of owning office towers, you're going to try to have everything to work. So at that point, it's like, okay, nothing else is working. It's older stock. What can we do in here? And to you obviously look at the residential, and like Stephen said, you look at first thing, is the location appropriate to have a residential use? Is the zoning, what are the zoning constraints that we have? And we have office towers in different cities. It's very different scenarios. The opportunities are very different, for example, in Calgary versus Toronto nowadays. So we look at all that. And then all the details that Stephen talked about, from how many elevators do we have, the floor plan, the mechanical, the environment, to at the end of the day, does the math work? Does all the work that needs to be done, once the location works, the zoning works, the building envelope and the floor plan work, then it's, does the math work? Can we make this work? There's this perception out there that it's very easy to do and it's much cheaper to do. None of those, I think Stephen can attest to that. None of those two are actually true. It is very hard to do. And I think all these factors need to be taken in consideration. I think most people that are considering that do take them in consideration.
Yeah, and it's only about 30% of all of the buildings we looked at actually work. So, that's fine because we don't need to convert every single building to deal with the vacancy issue. But you do have to start with the right building, otherwise you've got no chance of making it happen. So that is critical.
So we've got a bit of, there's the logistics of the actual building itself, and then there's looking at the market and how it fits in the market. And Anna, you brought up a really good point. Like, can you actually make the building work, even if maybe it does look great from a sort of a physical perspective to turn into office? Is it already performing well as an office? You might not want to touch it. But something that you mentioned, Anna, I'd like to see if Mary Ellen can flesh this out a little bit for us, is around the zoning and the land use permissions, and maybe some of the city policies or provincial policies that may either enable or get in the way of this.
So it's an important consideration in terms of that process. Municipalities have limited infrastructure, limited resources, and when you convert to residential, the water you need for all of those extra bathrooms is very different than when you have an office building. So those things need to be taken into account, and definitely the zoning process, the time to get to a shovel-ready situation is significant, and certainly part of the consideration when you're looking at financing one of these projects is how long before you can actually build, before you can actually get people into the building. And then the approval process is, as you say, meeting all of the policy requirements. When you look at big cities today, most of them are struggling dealing with the number of planning applications that are being processed as it is. So when you add an extra dimension to this, and you've got a limited number of staff, it becomes very, very challenging to get the results that you need in the time that you need.
Aidan,
So-
we should also mention that an important point is how much of the building is empty, right? That is a big consideration. Do you have a half empty building and you need to keep those tenants in there? Do you have a full, one big tenant that is leaving the building? So that is also a big consideration. It has a huge impact. It could have an impact financially. You might need to buy out tenants, not buy out tenants. So there's all these considerations that need to be taken when assessing the building as well.
Well, so then,
And
Anna,
on the policy side, you look at that in terms of, like, are you comfortable with mixed use, with part of the building remaining office and part of the building being moved to residential? Would be different than changing the whole building over.
well, I mean, it sounds like then that Toronto should be like a perfect candidate, because we have a pretty sort of mixed downtown by North American standards. And we, as I said off the top, we have a pretty high vacancy rate, but we're not hearing a lot about these types of conversions happening in the city. And over to you again. Why aren't we hearing more about it in Toronto? Is it an issue of the market? Is it an issue of the building stock? What's going on?
I think the building stock for sure, but it's the zoning. It's been prohibitive to do something like that. I think it's also important that we, as we're having this conversation today, people think about conversion and just think converting the existing building into a residential building. But very often, and as we saw in Toronto by the City of Toronto study that they're doing on office replacement, there's basically three scenarios that you could have, right? You could have just the conversion, you can have a replacement, which in Toronto they require you to replace the office, but then add residential, or then you can have an addition. And so I think that it was open to have the replacement in Toronto with a 1-by-1 and sometimes even more to replace more office. That had been allowed. The problem is that because there's such a high vacancy rate in Toronto, and because there's just not tenants out there, there's actually projects not moving forward because of that prerequisite of having that amount of office inside that project. Developers can't get the financing, they can't get the tenants, so the project can't move forward. So I think that the City of Toronto is now finally looking into this replacement policy and the conversion policy. At Planning and Housing, there was just a preliminary report, and we're going to have something coming forward in the fall. To do it as of right, which is crucial. You need to have the policies to make it easier, to make it quicker. And we'll see if they're going to be looking at some incentives. We know, and I'm sure Stephen can talk a lot more about this, but we know that Dream is doing a conversion in Calgary, and the way that it worked and the reason why it worked was because Calgary made a huge investment, not only in resources, in policy, but also in incentives as well, with an incentive of $75 a square foot that made the projects work. And that's why they have a number of them under development. We're doing one of those. And so it'll be interesting to see how much resources and incentives the City of Toronto will be putting forward. But the fact that they're opening it up to have this replacement looked at and the conversions, I think it's a good step forward. We just need to move ahead and take advantage of the opportunity. Given that CMHC just told us that housing starts is 60% down in Toronto compared to last June. So I think there's an urgency here to act quickly across the country, and in particular in major urban centers like Toronto.
So Mary Ellen, I think, Anna's brought up a couple of really good points there, well, a number of them, but ones that I think speak directly to how the city devises policy and puts in place the rules for development. One of those is the replacement rate. If you do, say, tear down an existing office building, you often at least have to replace the square footage that you've taken down. And sometimes there's a bit of a percentage rider that, as you increase non-residential uses, as you increase residential uses, you got to increase the non-residential uses, that office. So you're growing the office footprint yet again, perhaps even creating greater vacancies, but also creating a bit of a block sometimes to getting the financing you need to get a building going. I'm wondering, when you look at how the City of Toronto is approaching real estate conversion, do you see other things that are getting in the way, despite these high vacancy rates? It's not enough. Do you think that there's more the city could be doing in policy or incentives?
Yeah, definitely more in policy and incentives. And I think in terms of some of the comments that Anna's made too, Toronto's kind of a year and a half behind a lot of other major cities, whether you look at Canada or the US, in terms of tackling these problems. And there's a number of reasons for it, but the report that came out the other week is a good start in terms of changing some of those policies. Toronto does need to provide incentives, and incentives don't always have to be cash. A premium service level is a huge incentive. A shorter process, or as of right, some municipalities have talked about conversions, would go a long way. And as you say, being stuck right now with the replacement of office office for office at the same square footage. Plus all of the incentives you have to give for residential, the number of affordable units, for example. You need to have in a lot of incentives that are going to bring development forward. The cost of land in Toronto, as we've seen, is huge in comparison to other cities. And some of the issues are a little bit different. I think like Toronto and Ottawa has a number of needs that are different from, say, Calgary, where Calgary needed to bring people back into the downtown. Toronto dealt with that maybe 20 years ago, creating downtown, like when Barbara Hall brought in the King Spadina projects, and bringing residential into downtown. That was started, I guess that's 30 years ago. So there are some things that Toronto's been ahead on, but there are things that Toronto's fallen back on, and policy changes and incentives, I think, are part of that.
So it sounds like so far there's a lot of things we are doing that is getting in the way, and a lot of things we are not doing that is also getting in the way. But we have a history of being creative with this kind of thing. I remember, I don't know if it was called this at the time, but when I was in planning school, it was called the Kings, King in Parliament and King in Spadina, where we really relaxed the rules around these places and allowed building owners and tenants to figure out how to use them rather than locking that down. But Stephen, you've got perspective I'd love to hear, both in terms of the international view that Gensler gets to have, but also from going back to what you said right at the beginning, like there's some buildings that just don't lend themselves to it. So from your perspective, what are some things, again, maybe Toronto should be doing or should stop doing to support this? And is it just, maybe our buildings just don't lend themselves to it? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is what you said a couple of minutes ago. Housing starts are down 60%, right? In the meantime, Calgary has increased the number of housing units in downtown by 24%. So not only is Toronto behind by a few years, as Anna said, but we're falling further behind as well. The office needs study, which came out, which is a great step in the right direction, was nearly a year in the process. Meanwhile, Calgary's built 3,000 units. Like it's kind of ridiculous that we're still talking about policy, and they're still talking at council about adding riders to that policy of 25% affordability or whatever, when overall housing production is down massively. The idea of tying any office to it is honestly ridiculous at the moment, because if you went to a bank and said, hey, could you lend me money to build an office building, they will laugh at you. So
well, I think it's also you justified tearing down the building because it wasn't being used, and now you're going to completely rebuild it.
Yeah, exactly, or removing the office. So those policy starters are critical. There has to be, as a baseline, the ability to convert as of right in Toronto, and as you've seen in Calgary and is happening in other cities, as long as you don't make the building bigger, then that's fine. You should be able to convert as of right. That has also been widely kind of accepted by local neighbors and that kind of thing as well, because the building is there, they're used to it, they like it, and when you convert it, it's still there. It hasn't changed. You haven't you generally reduce traffic requirements and that kind of thing. So I think that has to be the starting point for Toronto, is just a very clear as of right conversion policy in all of downtown, and then let the market take it from there. The incentives piece is interesting because you're seeing that in most cities now. We've helped over a dozen cities put together incentive programs, whether that's like Calgary's cash incentive program or Chicago's tax abatement program, for example, and other cities are doing a similar thing. Does Toronto need that? I don't know. Maybe Anna can comment more on it, but it's not going to hurt the housing production, and it's certainly going to be required if you want to add extra layers of affordability into it as well. So that speed, and just saw someone's putting the thing about what does as of right mean. It means you can do it without going through zoning, which means you can take about a year and a half off of the timeline. So imagine how much money is spent during that year and a half while you're waiting for the city to do something. We'll give you an answer. You're paying fees, you're paying for an empty building, just wasting time and money that you're paying interest on your, on your loans. It's just wasting time and money that no one needs, and that time and money just goes on to the cost of people's rent afterwards.
So
that's
in
got
the
to be moved out of the way.
in the Toronto case, it's about getting out of the way, in short, or enabling it to take place, by the sounds of it. And we can maybe, given the heat in the housing market, or the demand at least, even if the market itself is slumping a little bit, Toronto might be able to just do with reducing the requirements and letting building owners and developers by right go and do some of these conversions. But and I'm always amazed at where I see the Dream logo in Ontario. So you've got more than just Toronto to look at, though we all use many of the same tools as the city of Toronto across Ontario. What are some of the things, like if a municipality wanted to show Dream that it was rolling out the red carpet for you to consider this kind of thing in their municipality, what should they be looking to do to support your decision making?
Yeah, so Dream does have offices in Ottawa, in Calgary, and Toronto. So we have experience in different cities, and we are doing, like I said, a conversion in Calgary. And the feedback that I get from the development team is that they've really rolled out the red carpet. Very quick process, dedicated team, incentives. And all the support that you need to go through some of the challenges that you face when you're going through a conversion. They've made it really, really easy and appealing to develop in there. And so that is a big plus. It's compared to what we're still dealing in Toronto, where we're still developing a policy where even for us to look at some of the buildings that we have in here, it's very different. It's challenging to project as well. And for us, for example, in downtown Toronto, we have a number of office towers. We have a number of projects. And I keep saying this as a former municipal politician and as somebody that works for a company that has an office REIT, an industrial REIT, and residential. I think the most important thing is, how do you keep the balance of the downtown? Like, for us, what we care is we want a thriving, vibrant downtown so that our office towers, our residential towers, all can succeed. And I think that after COVID, we need to rethink a little bit of that balance. We used to have, a certain amount of office that was required, but things have changed. Our way of work has changed. Our way of living has changed. We're still not 100% sure that is going to continue to be like that. And so, but it's clear that right now, the balance needs to be looked at. And I think that's what these policies need to do, is like, how do you bring the people, the vibrancy to the downtown so we can have a downtown recovery? So this is much more than just office conversions, to be honest with you. This is about how do we create vibrant neighborhoods, and in particularly the recoveries of the downtowns. And when I started this, I said, believe me, a lot of people that own the offices, they've looked at everything to make that office work. And now it's just about creating that balance. How do you get that balance on your portfolio, but also on the community where you are?
So it's not an all or nothing. We're not suggesting that municipalities, Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, or anywhere, just say, okay, floodgates open, everyone, just whatever you want to do, go ahead. It's about getting the balance, also setting the vision for how you want the neighborhood that these offices operate in to be. Stephen, are there other things that you would think, again, municipalities should be thinking about to get that balance right, to make sure that they're not going all in one way, or maybe hedging their bets a little bit too much in the other?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the all-in concern, which is what the office needs report was about in Toronto, is kind of absolute nonsense. We have 20% vacancy, or 18% vacancy. We should be getting that down to about 5%. So maybe 10% of the offices in the city convert. That's not going to change the city in a massive way. But if you look around the world, and we have offices all over. You look at a European city like Berlin or parts of London, their vacancy is about 6%. And it's 6% because their downtowns are mixed use. you know, they always have been. They've evolved this kind of patchwork of offices next to residential. And that's what actually really drives that vibrancy that Anna mentioned. Our neighborhoods, our residential neighborhoods outside of the city are doing really well. You know, Roncesvalles, where I live, the retail there has never been better, but it's never been better because there's people there. And that's not true in downtown. So the downtowns that are suffering the worst are these kind of monoculture ones. You know, Toronto is better than most, but that's why our vacancy is 18%. And you look at LA, like downtown LA, parts of that are over 50% vacant now, which is, you know, pretty shocking. But if you look across Europe, most of them are much lower. Most of the cities are thriving more. They've got more people back, more tourists back. In fact, the only place that I know of it in the UK that's struggling is Canary Wharf, which was modeled after a US city. And that has massive vacancy now, 25 to 30%. So we've got to, you know, I think move away from this concern that we're going to end up with an entirely residential downtown. It's just not going to happen. You know, there are great buildings down here. There are new buildings down here. The ones that are getting converted are the 60s, 70s buildings that are very, very dated, that have very, you know, low ceilings and have major problems, and no one wants to be there. That's the ones we've got to focus on. Those are the ones, and it's actually even more shocking than, you know, 70s and 80s ones. It's basically any building built pre-internet is now kind of useless as an office. So a lot of those are now getting snapped up for conversion. But it'll be 10%, you know, it's not going to be the entire city.
So Marielle, if I get you to put your sort of municipal hat on again for a little bit, and let's say we've got a municipality in Ontario, or maybe Toronto or Mississauga, that's thinking, let's loosen up a little bit, or maybe even encourage a little bit of looking at conversion or allowing landowners to consider conversion. What advice would you give them so that they're, you know, if they're worried about, you know, letting her rip or having those floodgates open, you know, notwithstanding what Stephen said a moment ago, that the risk might be slight. How would you talk to your councils or your planning staff to say, well, if that's the concern, here's something we can do to make sure that it doesn't go out of control or go too far in one direction?
Sure. So Canadian municipalities, and I think especially Ontario municipalities, are really risk averse. We're constantly studying things over and over again. And one thing we learned when we did the CAO report at the end of COVID was that municipalities had to be nimble, they had to respond, they had to set aside their concerns and act. And the world didn't fall apart. Everything worked. I think if municipalities could continue that momentum forward and in other areas, we can't afford to take years to study these things to death. We have to be able to be nimble, be quick. We can look at New York, we can look at Chicago, we can look at Calgary and Vancouver, and model things based on those. They won't be perfect, but we can adapt and model those. We have to be able to provide a premium service level in a fast way. We have to be responsive to the needs and the changes. And concerns, I think, about office, as has been talked about, we've seen periods where head offices have moved out of Toronto to the suburbs, and then they come back because they need to be in downtown Toronto. That's just become a reality, I think, over several decades. Everybody ends up down here, and having that mix in the suburbs, you talk about complete communities, live, work, learn, play, all in the same place, and bringing that forward into Toronto a little more, as Stephen has said, I think would go a long way to move things forward. But relaxing the rules is the big thing that I think needs to be done to move this forward.
And Aidan, the two issues of the need for more office and to attract tenants and to attract investment for the downtown is closely connected with housing. If you speak to any major employer, one of their biggest challenges is actually attract people to work because they say they can't afford to live in the city. You talk to any major hospital in downtown, they say one of the biggest issues for them to attract staff is because everybody, gets paid the same. Every nurse gets paid the same in the province of Ontario, and they can't afford to live in Toronto. They need to live in Mississauga. Which hospital are they going to choose to work at? Mississauga. So all these things are connected to housing. And when you have the housing crisis that you have right now, when you actually are supposed to be building more, and actually we're heading in the opposite direction, we're building less, as we just saw, you need to take advantage of all these avenues and opportunities. Things are changing. I mean, there's no reason why you can't look at this policy in 4 or 5 years from now. We do it with employment lands all the time. Every 5 years, we review, how are we doing on our employments? How are we doing? Do we need to tweak anything? Do we need to change anything? Municipalities could very easily, do something like this and reevaluate the policy and the needs of what is happening at that time. But given the crisis that we have right now, and given even to attract the jobs and the offices so that the office can continue to thrive, you need to create that supply of housing as well. Again, it's keeping that balance so that everything, both the office and the housing, works.
So clearly municipalities have like one of the most important roles in all of this, but this being Canada, we always got to ask, like, what could the province, or should the province, or can the federal government, or should the federal government be doing? And Stephen, I know you've been doing a fair bit of work on this, actually both direct in some ways with federal government decision making. But like, what do you think the role is for those two senior levels of government in terms of facilitating or participating in some of this conversion conversation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously CMHC is a massive help, and that's we've seen issues in the US where they don't have a version or as robust a version of CMHC. So that has been a big help in housing starts, although they are massively down. But that is where the money is coming from for most of the Calgary conversions. But federally, I think the big thing that's going to happen here and the US is that they've all promised to cut their amount of real estate by half. Now in the US, that means that the federal government's going to cut 300 million square feet of real estate, which is something like 8 times the size of Toronto. Here in Canada, it means they're going to cut about 30 million, which is 2/3 the size of Toronto. Now, we talked about this a little bit before, but if they turn around and do that, in a year or 2 years or whatever, that's going to be like when the car industry and the steel industry left Detroit. And that's going to have a huge impact on Ottawa. The provincial government cutting office space in Toronto is going to have a huge impact here. So I think the biggest thing they can do is really think about how they're going to lose office space, what leased space they're going to put back into the market, and the impact that's going to have. Because, as Anna's been saying, it's about vibrancy. And if you suddenly empty out a bunch of office buildings, that really hurts the surrounding ones as well. The value of them drops, and people's desire to go to them drops because retail starts to close and so on. So as they release that real estate, whether it's stuff they own or whether it's stuff that they're currently leasing, they really need to consider supporting the kind of stranded owners of those buildings into conversions, whether that's financially or just in the way they handle the zoning of those buildings. But if they suddenly give back 30 million square feet, that's going to be the end of some cities. Ottawa especially, it's going to be the new Detroit if they really move out of half their real estate there.
Well, I mean, that's shocking. So just sort of letting that sink in a little bit. When you say 2/3 of Toronto, you mean 2/3 of the office buildings in Toronto suddenly being empty at the same time? That's what Ottawa is looking at?
Yeah, by equivalent square footage, I can't remember the number totally off the top of my head, but I think we've got like 57 million square feet in Toronto.
Wow. So without figuring out ways, I mean, that sounds like we're going to need to do more than just sort of, as we were talking about, sort of getting out of the way of allowing these conversions to take place. There's probably other things the feds and the province should be doing. Mary Ellen, given your experience, again, like thinking you were at a city and you had an ask you could make of the feds or the province in this conversation, what do you think they could either start doing or stop doing that would be helpful?
Yeah. I think they have a big role to play in helping municipalities deal with the infrastructure crisis that everyone is facing. Coming to the table with some cash for those kinds of things, whether it's in the form of grants or whether it's in the form of loans. There's the CIB, which is also very active in terms of supporting development in cities. I do like the idea of dealing with surplus lands, and I understand that in some places that will be a problem, but there are a lot of smaller municipalities that have federal or provincial buildings that have not been used in a long time, and those lands could be converted into housing in a way that would bring money to the government, but would also create projects that are needed for locals to stay in their communities. In a lot of the smaller communities, you see that the young people are all leaving to the city, and then some of them are coming back because now that people can work remotely, but and they can't afford to live in the city, then it's where do you put them? So they will come back. So I think dealing with some of those would be helpful. I think when you're talking about the really big cities, and when you're talking about Toronto and Ottawa as well, because of its attachment to issues, some of the policies that the federal and provincial government make need to think about the impact they have on municipalities. Policies around immigration and asylum seekers have a big impact on municipalities needing to provide housing. So those need to be tied together. Municipalities can't be forgotten about, and as not being a constitutionally recognized level of government, that tends to happen sometimes. And it's an expensive problem. Yeah, I think they need to move together to bring municipalities to the table as a partner to those discussions that they have.
Yeah, just to be clear, I do think the federal government should give up a huge amount of space because they have too much and there's better use for that land. They just need to be really careful in doing it and support the people who are getting buildings back.
Well, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's not really an all or nothing. And it sounds like if we had to have advice for the federal government when it comes to Ottawa, it's like definitely not all or nothing.
Yeah, and their role of tenants or owners, because they own some buildings and they lease some buildings. So the role of tenants and owners cannot be disconnected from this bigger role that they need to work with the cities in the housing creation and the developers and how to maintain this vibrancy. That's what we really need to make sure, that there's not somebody just looking at getting rid of the space and then another one just looking at what to do with the public lands. They need to be interconnected. The connection needs to be made. Right,
like it can't just be that, like, oh, we're just going to empty out our office and sell it. Like if someone else can't do something with that building, then you're not going to be able to sell it. It's just going to sit empty. So there's all of these things are tied together. If you're thinking about, thinking about, the Dream looking at its portfolio and what it might want to do with the building or in a particular city in Canada, what would you tell the provincial or federal government that they could do to be useful in your decision making or in having the best outcome for a city? So also sort of thinking of it back from that city leader position. Well, I think Mary Ellen and Stephen put it really well. I think the financing through the CMHC programs is crucial. To be honest with you, the construction that is happening, a lot of it is what CMHC has been financing, the projects that are still penciling it in. So financing is crucial. The kinds of incentives, the regulations, provincial planning acts are, in Ontario, it's Ontario Planning Act. So their role as regulators is important to facilitate that and to
speed things up and do it and give some certainty, which in certain provinces like Ontario, we've been grappling a little bit with so much change as well. So, how do you balance that quick change and back and forth, and to make sure that you're actually giving some certainty to the market as well. And the infrastructure, I think, is really important. We talk about this conversion. We know that the costs, as much as people think that it's cheaper, it is not. But what we know is that 25 to 30% of the cost of producing housing in this country is taxes and fees. And it's to pay for that growth. And we know that the growth is happening and infrastructure needs to be built. And I think that conversation about how do we pay for that infrastructure, we know that municipalities don't have the tools to pay for it. So how do we have that conversation as a country and as a province to support our municipalities to pay for this growth without just being on the back of the new people that are buying homes or the new people that are renting new homes? I think it's time that we have that conversation. 15 years ago, everybody was very proud to say growth pays for growth. Well, given that our generation has benefited from so much of how well the real estate has been doing, I'm not sure it's not time that we say, maybe we shouldn't just put it on the backs of the new generations, the upcoming generations. Maybe it is time that we do something different on how to pay for this infrastructure. I think we all agree that the infrastructure needs to be built, needs to be paid. But if we're talking really about affordability, when you have 25 to 30% in development charges and fees and so on, you need to have a conversation about that as well. And so I think both the province and the Fed need to have a serious conversation on how to fund infrastructure and municipalities to support the growth that we need.
So shifting gears a little bit, we've spoken a lot about buildings like the one I'm in right now in downtown Toronto, in Calgary, in Ottawa, but I've heard some people talk about other opportunities for conversion elsewhere, not just in the city centers. There are some, Mary Ellen, you mentioned a moment ago, there are some of those office park style developments. Then we've also heard about other potential uses, other institutional uses, other healthcare uses, long-term care uses. But Mary Ellen, if what are some of those, other sort of maybe properties or uses that you would zero in on and say we should be, not just these big buildings behind me, but what else should we be looking at here for conversion, both the property and the potential future use of it?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is strip malls. There are a lot of old strip malls that have outworn their existence and their use. And I think they're sitting on extremely valuable property to be able to turn some of those into residential uses for housing, for long-term care, and even the major regional malls. When you look at Mississauga, Square One comes to mind, but there are a lot of other malls as well. The city brought in a policy about 5 years ago called Reinventing the Malls, where it's focused on allowing development around it. So like adding office towers that will surround the mall property, adding uses inside the mall itself that support residential, maybe putting a tower on top of some of the retail uses where there's a lot of vacancies. There are a lot of potential. Long-term care homes are another use that ties in with some of that. And in the US, these have been developing for a very long time, and they would go forward, I think, here to make a huge difference in terms of dealing with those lands. And the more we can cut the red tape and we can create opportunities for development to happen quicker, I think the better off we would be.
So we shouldn't leave commercial spaces out of our thinking when we talk or retail spaces when we're talking about the conversion conversation.
Definitely not. Definitely not, especially once you get into the broader community outside of Toronto or outside of the GTA, where office is hard to, you don't find office towers.
Yeah. And to that, Anna, do you have at Dream, do you have other types of buildings other than these office towers that you look at, or even if you don't have in the developer community, are you hearing talk of other types of buildings or other uses that they could have after office?
I think in the developer community, you see many, even in urban centers. I know that Mary Ellen talked about, in smaller and other centers, but even in urban centers, these malls are being looked at. As a city councilor, I had, and I was a Toronto West downtown. It's almost downtown at Dupont and Dufferin. You had the Galleria Mall that is completely under redevelopment, and there's plans for Yorkdale as well. So there are significant plans that I think developers are looking into some of these commercial malls, and I think Mary Ellen is absolutely right. We need to increase the density. We need to increase the uses. We need to create the mixed income communities in there. So absolutely. At Dream, we pride ourselves, and many of our projects are about those complete communities. You look at communities that we're building now, like Quayside or Zibi in Ottawa, or Alpine in Calgary. It's all mixed communities. It's retail, it's some office, it's parks and schools and community uses, and residential as well. So we're always looking at aspects of complete communities in majority of the projects that we have.
So it's not just about the building itself, it's about where, again, back to some of your earlier points, like where is the building? What's around the building? What can we do with this entire space? So taking a holistic look at the building envelope, but also its surroundings. But
Very much so.
But we're sort of back to the where I think Stephen started us off. Not all buildings lend themselves to this. And so when we're looking at real estate conversion opportunities that are not these giant office towers, what are some of the considerations that you'd bring forward, both in terms of the type of building that exists, but also the future use it could have?
I'm not sure who that question was.
You, Stephen.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I mean, to what we were just saying, basically anything outside of the city that has surface parking is being densified. And that's true not just in Toronto, but in other locations as well. And I think that's critical. It's not about converting a mall, it's about putting things around the mall to spur on the success of it as a retail offering. What we're seeing with other buildings that aren't necessarily suitable for residential is a little bit of higher education. It's a little bit of senior living, a little bit of student housing, but it's the conversion to residential is the easiest one, and even that's not easy. And it's easiest because there's a big housing need, because residential rents are quite high, and because everything about a residential building is a lower code requirement than an office building. You have less people, less floor loading, less elevator requirements, etc. So the other uses are rather minimal, but I think that's fine. Like we don't need to figure out what to do with every single office building. If you take 10% out of the market through conversions, the rest are going to do great, and that's going to give you that mixed use vibrancy that you're after. Coming back to Calgary again, they've done 17 buildings out of about 120 in the downtown. They're almost at that 10%. They're going to go a bit higher because the vacancy there was so bad, but that's really where we're going to see the limit. And I always find it amusing when people are like, well, what happens if every building converts? It's like, I don't know where all the office workers go then. Like it's not really a big worry.
So it's a bit.
Aidan, I think we need to mention this, at least for the ones of us that are in Toronto, after the flooding that we had yesterday, and that is happening a lot more frequently. Some of the ones that are being considered for conversion, and some of the ones that are that have very high vacancy rate, are highly ineffective buildings. And so having these conversions to make them more environmentally friendly, reducing the GHGs, also has a big impact on going towards a more environmentally friendly downtown and having better buildings. So I think it's important to note that as well, as we think about these things, as we see what happened to the downtown. when we have buildings that are highly ineffective, having the opportunity to not only address the housing issue, but also to turn them into more environmentally friendly building, I think it is an opportunity that we should take.
Yeah, and that's critical, right? Because the construction industry is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions. The concrete industry alone is 8% of all global carbon emissions. That's 4 times the amount that the entire airline industry is. So actually converting these buildings rather than tearing them down or rather than building new is the easiest impact that we can have on carbon emissions, especially in Canada where there is a huge amount of construction happening. Actually doing more conversions and less new build will make a massive impact. It's got like 40% of the country's carbon emissions that you could start making a significant dent in, and then upgrade them, replace the facades, change the systems, electrify them, and so on. All helps, but the best building or the most sustainable building is the one you already have. So that's where we should be focusing, and then maybe we'll have a little less of the extreme flooding and weather events we've had recently.
So I'm going to shift over to some of the questions we have from the audience now, and if you haven't already, as audience members, feel free to send your questions in, and we'll get to as many as we can. But this first one touches on actually just what we were talking about a moment ago, and so I'm sort of thinking, if someone, a property owner, a developer comes to me and says that they would like to do an office conversion, from what we've heard from you, Steve, and Anna in particular, not everything lends itself to that. So if someone's coming and saying, I can take this existing building envelope and I can do something different with it, residential, it actually is a bit of a rarer situation, or we shouldn't see it as like, oh, anyone can do that with any building. Someone's actually gone through the back end and looked at how this building will perform financially. And so a question we have from the audience is, how does that conversion change those finances for the developer or the management company in terms of rent, maintenance fees? I guess we could throw taxes in there as well. I'm not sure, Anna or Stephen, which of you might want to take a crack at that first, or Mary Ellen?
I won't talk about the financial model because I'll get myself in trouble as the architect here. So I don't know if you want to tackle that, Anna, and I can definitely talk about the tax piece afterwards because I've a good experience on that.
Yeah, well, the financial model it starts first and foremost. It starts from everything to what kind of occupancy do you have. You look at everything from the leases that you have. Do you have to buy out people? All that needs to be taken into consideration when you're considering and you're doing your performer and your work. How much do you have as a loan, for example? Do you have a loan on your office building? What's the net value assessed of the building? Like there's a lot that is taken into consideration. And then again, all these things, how much environmental work do you need to do you expect to do? How much the mechanical is expected to do? So it's a very different kind of work, even as you prepare the pro forma and as you work these financials to make sure that the math adds up. There's a lot more that you need to take in consideration. I know that we're putting a lot more, for example, in the contingency, because this is all new, fairly new for everybody. So usually you just want to make sure that there's a bit more in the contingency as well. And then once in terms of rents and pro forma, it's like any other rental building. The rents of that neighborhood and that location, that's what you're putting in your pro forma and the income and so on.
I think one of the things you mentioned about like your loan and how much you're holding as the existing assessed value is kind of very interesting. We've seen buildings that we've looked at and we've done designs on, and the owners said, oh, it doesn't work. My building's worth $150 a square foot. That's what I'm holding the value as office. And then, 2 years later, I hear that the building defaulted and is sold. We had one in Calgary that was $150 a square foot, didn't pencil as a residential conversion, defaulted and sold at $35 a square foot. Now it works. So there is a little bit of denial, I think, on what the existing values are, and that's leading to a huge amount of defaults. It's much worse in the US right now. It's something like 80% of buildings are predicted to not be able to renew their loan their CMBS loan, which is very concerning. But that has to be taken into account. Like, what's the real value of the building, not what do you wish it was worth, or what did you pay for it 10 years ago? It's in buildings in New York. Canadian Pension Plan sold one of their buildings for $1, or half of a building for $1. We've seen buildings with negative values because their land value minus demolition cost is their value. So that's an important starting point.
I think another question we have, and I'll paraphrase a little bit and maybe start with Mary Ellen for the answer, but when the planning departments give approvals, they take a look at what infrastructure there is to support the proposed development or redevelopment, and that capacity factors into the decision-making process. And then there is also an issue around like commercial tax rates versus residential tax rates. Like, I mean, it does sound like we're talking about slightly more limited conversions, but again, like thinking, from a municipal perspective, do you think there's going to be a huge gap between those allocation issues or that revenue, that tax revenue, based on what we've been talking about today?
I don't think so. I think that can be dealt with in terms of you do need to, municipalities do need to bring some cash to the table. They have to bring something to the table. So it can be attributed, I think, in a way that works for municipalities dealing with the financial difference. Residential is less, so there will be a bit of an impact. But given number of units and things, that could change in favor of the municipalities. So it may or may not be a problem.
So really a case by case kind of thing.
I think so.
It's a city by city thing as well. But I also, to what you said, residential does pay less than commercial. But that's assuming the commercial is paying tax at all, and empty buildings don't pay tax.
True enough.
I was in New Orleans recently speaking at a conference of tax lawyers, and the only thing they were talking about, there's about 350 people there, was every single one of them was suing whatever city they were from to have their assessed value drop down to 0. And those buildings the buildings they were working on are paying 0 tax. So that is critical. You can't, as a city, say, well, residential will pay less tax because it might be compared to nothing, compared to an empty building paying 0 tax.
Yeah.
And if you're doing
sorry. No, our system in terms of going through the impact process and how they value things is a little bit different. That it would be hard to do that, but we do give vacancy rebates to
So Anna, I'm gonna have to give the last word to you.
If you're adding units, not only you might not be getting 0, but you're actually getting significant amount of more residential. So you're probably, even if the building was full, you're probably ending up at the same time and having more housing units to provide to the residents of the city.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, so we'll have to leave it there. There are a couple of questions that we didn't get to, so if those questioners would like us to follow up on their behalf, please email the email address that sent the link to today's webinar. But on behalf of StrategyCorp, I'd like to thank Stephen, Mary Ellen, and Anna for all of your insights today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon and joining future webinars, maybe just as an audience member next time.